I've had this idea for a while now of making carbon fiber art, so I finally decided to give it a try. I started out with Wonder Web as a backing for this, and it's a fusible web so I can iron on all these pieces of carbon fiber to create a design. So I cut carbon fiber into different lengths and started arranging that over the top of the Wonder Web. And then as I finished an area, I used a heat iron to iron those pieces in place onto that fusible web. I have Teflon peel ply here that works as a non-stick surface so that my iron won't get fused to the web. Sometimes it's difficult to set that non-stick sheet down without disturbing the placement of the carbon fiber. So in some areas I just carefully used the corner of the heat tool to tack the carbon fiber into place, and then later went back in and ironed over the whole piece to secure it in place fully. I had a reference image that I was working from of a photo of a landscape, so I used these different lengths of carbon fiber to sort of just draw out the blocks of shapes for these. Had a few main elements that I decided to include in this design, which was that horizon line with the mountains, some grass down at the bottom, and then this tree right in the center. To create the tree, I used long pieces of carbon fiber tow and twisted and arranged that into branch shapes and tacked that down onto the backing. Once all of the branches were in place, then I placed that non-stick sheet over top and ironed it down more securely so that the branches will stay in place while I'm adding resin later. Sometimes if you try to take off that Teflon non-stick sheet too soon, it will stay kind of stuck to the backing and start to pull it up, so you just have to make sure to let it cool down long enough until it releases easily. For the branches on the tree, I had this bag of carbon fiber that was kind of messed up, not like perfect pieces, which looked really good for leaves, so you get a lot of variety in the textures there. It's all about a 1/2 inch long, but I just arranged that into blocks of leaves over top of my branches and then ironed each of those sections into place. Now when you take off that release sheet from chopped carbon fiber like this, some of it's going to stay stuck to the sheet, and that's fine. Those are pieces that didn't get bonded properly anyway, so they would have been a problem once you're adding resin. So whatever comes off is fine. You can shake out the excess even, and then if you find an area needs some extra carbon, just add a bit of the extra Wonder Web and re-iron that down to make sure it's properly bonded so that it's going to stay put in the resin stage. Once I had my design complete, I ripped away and trimmed away as much of the excess backing Wonder Web as I could. Once you add resin, it pretty much disappears anyways, but I've noticed it can show up just a little bit, so I removed as much of that as I could. For the backing behind this carbon fiber, I decided to use some silver fiberglass, and I cut a piece of that to fit. Then on the edges, I've used more of the Wonder Web to stop the fraying on that. Now you can use tape, which is the more common method, but the thing with tape is when you're adding resin, one, it can start coming off a little bit. Two, it makes it harder for excess resin to flow out over the edges once you're vacuum bagging it, so you can end up with more trapped air. And also, it's just really easy to work with once you have that backing ironed onto the edges, so I prefer that method. With the edges all bound using the Wonder Web, then I ironed the tree design onto the silver fiberglass backing. For the bottom of this, I decided to use a piece of forged carbon fiber fabric. This one has some silver leaf mixed in too. This fabric is pretty easy to make. I have a tutorial on that I'll add a link for, but it's a nice contrast to the silver at the top. Even though this is carbon fiber on top of more carbon fiber, the grass section that I hand laid still shows up on the forged carbon fiber fabric because that has smaller pieces and they're randomly laid versus the strategically placed directional fibers that make up the grass. Next, I mixed up some deep pour epoxy from Total Boat. I like this resin because it has a very long open time, so I have no pressure to rush. In the areas where the carbon fiber is bound by the Wonder Web, there it's pretty easy to just dab the resin on top and it doesn't disturb the fibers. Now on the forged carbon fiber fabric, it's a little more finicky trying to add resin to the front, so I more just drizzled it on, a little bit of careful dabbing, but for that I'm going to mostly be adding the resin from the back. This is how the carbon looks when I've put on the resin. And just let that soak in and use the brush to work it around where I can. I'm going to add a top layer of the Teflon peel ply. But this is actually an interesting result even just right here, especially with the chopped carbon fiber area here. So it could be that this is maybe a good way to do it, just put the resin on without adding a top. But we'll have to see how it compares to the final version once I finish out the project. But this is already looking pretty interesting here. Next, I placed another piece of the Teflon peel ply over top of the design and pressed out as much of the air as I could. I also used this rubber roller to roll those air pockets out towards the edges as much as possible. It's not perfect, but I did the best I could. And then I flipped the whole thing over so that I could add more resin to the back of the piece. It's very easy to add resin to forged carbon fiber fabric from the back because it has this carbon fiber veil backing that keeps the bundles of carbon fibers in place so you don't mess up the pattern, but you can just dab on that resin and spread it out and make sure it's thoroughly wetted out. The amount of resin I mixed up was a little more than 1-to-1 of the weight of my parts versus the weight of the resin, so it was about 500 grams that I mixed up, and that ended up being enough resin, so that was pretty good. I also placed 3 layers of just a plain old woven carbon fiber onto this to thicken it up and reinforce everything. And I just wetted out each layer individually, spread it using a brush and a plastic scraper. And then a heat tool to pop as many of the air bubbles as possible. Before adding on that second layer of Teflon peel ply again. And placing everything into a vacuum bag. I also placed this on top of a large sheet of HDPE and it's pretty thick so it stays flat because I didn't want this to end up having a curve to it or anything. Okay, well it's in the vacuum bag now. I'm going to turn the vacuum back on, just leave it on, because I don't know if it's a perfectly sealed bag. For vacuum bagging with this, when it's a wet layup like that, not an infusion, it doesn't have to be a perfect seal. I accidentally cut the hole a little too big here, so I had to add a little bit of the sealant gum. But yeah, this is what we're going to be doing here, is just leaving it to cure in this bag with the vacuum and hope for the best. Once it was cured, then comes the exciting part where you remove all of the packaging and peel off that peel ply to see how everything turned out. The back was nothing special, that's just the plain carbon fiber. Not terribly flat on that side because I didn't have a second sheet to add on the top of that to compress it. So then I flipped it over and removed the peel ply from the front side. Here's the finished piece, fresh out of the mold. I've just taken off all of the peel ply, and the result is pretty good. There are a few pinholes somewhere in here. Oh, there it is, I can feel it, yeah. A few pinholes in the chopped carbon area, but everything integrated pretty well. Like, there's still a little bit of texture where there's higher and lower spots from the different layers, but overall there's no ledges. Everything's smooth and got kind of pressed into the backing layers to make a smooth front piece. And the backing with the Wonder Web, that didn't cause any issues with wet out because I did wet it from the front and the back. So any reduction in the ability of the resin to permeate through that was just not even an issue with wetting it out from both sides. There is a little bit of distortion in the silver weave here. I'm not sure how that happened, but I think in future it might be best just to go ahead and use the Wonder Web backing on this backing fabric also, just to make it really easy to work with and not have any issues with distortion to worry about. So with the carbon fiber, of course, you get, depending on how the light hits it, a nice kind of almost holographic 3D effect there, which is kind of the perk of using carbon fiber. It is a little reflective and it looks different from every angle. And you've got the lovely chopped carbon fiber tree here, which turned out very well. I like how these kind of sort of like messed up chopped pieces, it looks more organic and natural, tree-like. Whereas down here, the chopping is much more neat and tidy, which is a nice contrast. Got a little bit of that silver leaf in there, just for a little bit of extra interesting texture. Overall, I would say it was quite successful, and definitely is a viable sort of way of using the carbon fiber. So I just need to explore in future more options and ideas for that. Overall, that's pretty cool. I'm happy.